All right, we are ready to get started. Welcome everyone to the June 6, 2012 meeting of the Amherst Zoning Subcommittee. First item on our agenda tonight is announcements and minutes. I don't have any announcements and we don't have any minutes, so we will move on directly to the main item on our agenda, which is future zoning, number 2. We have 3 things to talk about here. Town meeting debriefing, which is basically a continuation of the conversation that we began at the select board meeting most recently. Review of the draft work list and timelines, and preparation for next week's meeting's zoning forum, which is in 2 weeks from tonight on June 20th. So we had a discussion 2 weeks ago at the planning board regarding town meeting. I'm not sure how much more needs to be done by this body at this point. Bruce, you weren't at that meeting, so you did not have a chance to participate. Was there anything that you wanted to discuss or bring up or talk about?
Not at this time. No.
Rob, did you have anything additional? Jonathan?
No, I would note that the planning board members who spoke to this, and it was a lengthy discussion, were sort of all over the map. There were people who were in, the only consistent position was that everybody was in favor of going forward. It was the how that got interesting. Some people wanted to go with just one village center, others with another, some with both. Some wanted to do things in the fall, some wanted to wait until the spring, until other things were completed. And so the full range of possibilities was discussed by the board.
So Bruce, mostly for your benefit, where we stand with the planning board's position right now is we didn't take any position on the board in terms of our priorities going forward. The board felt that it was worth waiting until after the zoning forum on June 20th. To then have another discussion. I think we have an agenda item scheduled for that evening on the planning board agenda to have a discussion about priorities. The position that I was advocating to the board was to have the board more involved in the decision-making process rather than having it be driven from the subcommittee, which has been more of our standard practice. But I thought it was very healthy and productive to have the board engaged in the zoning issues that we brought to town meeting this spring, and I'd like to continue that practice going forward.
Sure, that's a good idea.
Okay, so we'll talk more about that at our planning board meeting on June 20th. I'll remind folks in the room and the folks who are watching at home on Amherst Media that our next meeting of the zoning subcommittee, which is Wednesday, June 20th at 5 p.m. in this room, which is the town room at Town Hall, is our semi-annual zoning forum, when we invite members of the public, who are always invited to our meetings, but we invite people specifically to give us feedback about their thoughts and priorities on zoning issues, which then inform our judgment on the subcommittee and the planning board about what priorities we intend to move ahead with. So with that said, Jonathan, would you like to review the issues that we have in front of us on the list of potential zoning items?
Yes, let me emphasize what you just said. This is a list of potential items. Some of these are continuing issues. Some of them are new issues that have been brought to us by others. Others are arising out of the community's attempt to deal with housing issues. So there's a sort of a mix here of priority A potentials, and there's some semblance of an attempt to try and project forward if some things go forward or don't go forward, when they would next appear and so forth. There's an attempt at a schedule here, but this is just a staff draft for purposes of discussion, and it's nobody's official anything. In addition to the 2 village center zoning articles, staff have been meeting and corresponding with consultant planners from the Pioneer Valley Planning Commission to talk about the prospect of adding transfer of development rights zoning provision to the bylaw, and how that would interact with a number of the other things that we're doing, including potential village center zoning. And I think at your at the next planning board meeting, there was an intent to have that representative, Christopher Curtis, who is the senior planner for their land use division, come and speak about that issue generally, and not so much in terms of where drafts are at any given point, but to talk about the issue in general and prepare the planning board for that question going forward.
I'm sorry, who did you say he's with?
Christopher Curtis of the Pioneer Valley Planning Commission. We also are in the process of negotiating with consultants to begin the floodplain analyses. Some of that is field work, much of it is computer mapping work and communication between the consultants and the federal folks at FEMA in terms of what's acceptable for new flood insurance rate map determinations. So that is a semi-remote possibility for the fall. It is much more likely to be the spring. But that also affects some of the other work that's going on. The next listed item here, residential use amendments, is part of the, and will be offered for your consideration as part of the housing, the community's attempt at safe and healthy neighborhoods housing efforts. What we're looking at is what appears to be the most substantial area in which housing is changing is in the conversion of small numbers of units, whether those are single-family residences, duplexes, or converted dwellings, into rentals. And what we're attempting to do is look at our current regulations addressing each of these residential use categories and see if there are ways in which we can amend those that would give the community more control over those changes. And those will be coming forward for your review. A continuation, the permit findings criteria or performance standards, which was an outgrowth of the development modification work that you have been doing. We have a new request from the Department of Environmental Preservation or protection rather, to amend the zoning to bring our regulations in association with surface water, public water supplies into better conformance with their regulations. It appears at this point that will be principally done through health regulations, Board of Health regulations, but there may need to be some corresponding changes in the zoning as well, so that the two track in tandem and are mutually supportive. There's the possibility that the functional family definition, which some of you may remember, might also come forward as an amendment. Part of what that would do is, in addition, right now we have a definition in the bylaw for family, and it includes 3 categories: individuals living by themselves in households, families that are related in one way or another in a legally recognized fashion, living together in a household, and up to 4 unrelated persons, unrelated using the same criteria as used in the second category in a single household. What we do not have is a definition that allows the bylaw and our enforcement folks to recognize families that do not fall into any of what are now the legally recognized categories, but function as families, as distinct from a group of strangers just sharing resources. There are a number of characteristics which would essentially define a family. People may or may not be married, but they may well have children. They may, in the schools, they may be living here and working here, sharing ownership of everything in the household. There are a number of ways in which the town can recognize and acknowledge households that are functioning as families, even if they are not recognized otherwise. So that's another possibility. We may have other technical fixes that arise as we look at the bylaw, and then there are the possibility for petition articles, and then there is that is what we could foresee readily and quickly. There is all of what will come to you at the zoning forum.
So in that section, do you guys have any questions or comments about any of those items? I have a couple. One, on the functional families, is there precedent for that elsewhere?
Yes.
That you're aware of?
Yes, it's used in a number of communities in New England and in the Northeast as a way of balancing out the kinds of restrictions that come in with households of no more than a certain number of unrelated persons. We don't want to get into a situation where we are protecting ourselves with one hand from the impacts of unrelated households, and on the other hand, negatively impacting what are effectively families. This creates that balance, or attempts to.
My other point was under the residential use amendments. I would very much like us to have another attempt to modify the duplex conversion regulations that we did in the spring of last year, or fall of last year, I can't remember which, that would have created a separate category for owner-occupied versus non-owner-occupied duplexes and regulate the latter by special permit. I think that it's unfortunate that town meeting missed an opportunity to better govern those conversions in exactly the types of ways that you were describing, and I think that that's worth prioritizing to take another crack at that.
There's actually one missing in that listing of single-family duplex converted dwelling. There's also a use category, residential use category called lodging or boarding.
Mm-hmm.
And a number of communities regulate the commercial use of single-family dwelling units through a lodging or boarding bylaw. Often it's not zoning, often it's a general bylaw or ordinance. We're not yet at the point where we're proposing to do that, but part of what we want to do is look at the categories that are related to these set of changes and make sure they are as well written and tight as they can be. And we may propose to include lodging or boarding house as a category, simply to clean up that language as part of this sort of preparatory to later changes, if there are any.
Bruce?
Is anybody working on the idea of the private student housing on the campus? We've talked about this, that I think the last we heard was the town attorney was looking into this about whether that state law was actually an impediment or not, but I don't think we've heard anything more about that.
We have not heard any resolution of that. I know that the university itself is looking at that, and we certainly support them in doing so. The first few runs they had made at talking to the legislature or talking to folks at the state level about whether or not the university could enter into a public-private partnership whereby private entities built student housing essentially on university property, were not promising. There was a lot of strong pushback from folks who wanted to retain the protections that are inherent in public bidding, public projects, Davis-Bacon wages, and so forth, which makes many of these projects prohibitively expensive from the standpoint of the institutions. But there are people looking at that. I'm not aware that our town attorney right now is looking at that. We're more sort of standing ready should there be a need to support the university's efforts to do that.
Is there any way we could be involved with that? I mean, it seems so important that if we could have any kind of input or reports from the university from time to time about this.
I think that conversation is occurring. One of the challenges in these things is that the institution wants, which is the state for all intents and purposes, and doesn't have to talk to us if it doesn't want to, is talking to us, but often wants to keep the nature of that conversation because they're not quite sure which direction they're going or how much authority they have in any given situation. They want to keep that conversation private and not leave it open to a public forum. So for the time being, those conversations, so far as I know, are private, but that is being looked at, and that is a very important issue.
It might be difficult for us to find a role in that strictly from a zoning perspective, because, looking at zoning, we don't really deal with specific projects, and this would be more the encouragement or the facilitation of a specific partnership between the university and a private developer, which we would want to make sure that the zoning allowed that, but I'm not sure that we would participate in moving a project like that forward. I do think that our zoning for everything that covers the university itself is all zoned EDU, which allows pretty much anything that's related to teaching and learning, and so that would definitely fall into that category. So I think we would be covered there in terms of permitting it through the zoning.
Okay.
Other questions or comments? In terms of the more distant priorities, Jonathan, is there anything that you specifically wanted to highlight there?
Well, we have upcoming changes will include some kind of a process once we have made progress on the village centers for the town center and the gateway corridor, which is all one entity at this point in terms of how it's being examined. There are other changes that will be coming forward that you will be hearing about, and if you're interested in them, we can bring them to you, that are general bylaws amendments, some that will correspond to and enhance but have no grandfathering with regard to residential rental parking. Better controls there. There is the possibility of a concept for nuisance property bylaw section. Right now we have a nuisance house section which addresses principally partying and underage drinking is the purpose of that. This would be more looking at whether or not the maintenance of rental properties is maintaining a safe and healthy situation on the property. There are a number of indices of public health that, in fact, the health inspectors now use when they go out if they encounter these situations. Get the couches off the lawns and so forth. And it's not a question principally of aesthetics, although it has that impact. It's principally a question of health. If the grass is kept too long and it's weedy, then there are a range of pests and moisture and so forth that can occur. You can have increases in insect-borne disease and so forth. Same thing with a fabric couch out on the lawn in the rain and so forth. That becomes habitat for a range of vermin and so forth. So it's that kind of thing, and safety in terms of the maintenance of the structures as well on the outside. This would be looking at the exterior. It would not be so much a code question as strengthening and a repetition of local regulations, enforcing what is already possible under health sanitary code.
And to that, I would add maybe a stronger effort from the board perspective to put conditions in permits that speak to issues like that. I know we've tried to do that recently in a couple of the site plan reviews that we've encountered, and if boards had a stronger commitment to making sure that the management plan spoke to issues like that, putting relevant conditions about the leases like we did in a recent duplex conversion. We can't really encode that in the bylaw itself, but I think that it's a good practice for boards to be protective of the public space when they consider permit applications.
You can, through your rules and regulations, enhance the kinds of information that you require be submitted that would inform those kinds of conditions and so forth. And it might be worth looking at those. And also going back and reviewing the kinds of conditions that both the Planning Board and the Zoning Board of Appeals use in addressing rental housing and other similar situations, and sort of compiling them and see if they're, seeing if there's a way to improve and standardize them so that they become, additions to the, the regular three that we already
Right.
use.
Any other comments or questions on the priority list?
Well, I wonder if we're going to talk about transfer of development rights, that seems like that would be a natural to go along with discussions about the town center. So I wonder about maybe putting those two together instead of having the transfer of development rights first and then following with the town center at some future time. Because that seems like that would be integral.
Jonathan, go ahead.
Part of what a transfer of development rights amendment or bylaw includes is the creation of both sending zones, the areas from which rights are being sent, and receiving zones, the areas in which whatever the density calculated out on the sending zones is being received and added to what's already allowed under the regulations. Mm-hmm. So it is just sort of automatic that part of what you will be doing, if you're looking at the transfer of development rights amendment, not regardless of the rest of it, but in consideration of the rest of what you're doing, is saying, where is it appropriate and useful to have these units come?
Right.
You know, for instance, should there be the capacity for any sending zone to send to any receiving zone in town? Or should specific receiving zones have sort of catchment areas of sending zones around them, village centers? Should their adjacent open space be only going to those village centers? There will be a range of questions. Mr. Curtis has a rather extensive experience with this, and we'll be able to hopefully answer a lot of those questions at the planning board meeting.
Okay, thanks.
All right, anything else? All right, seeing none. I'm not aware of any additional topics to be added to the agenda. Are you, Jonathan?
No.
I'm sorry, I skipped over the zoning forum preparation, but I'm not sure that there's anything specifically that we need to do to prepare for that. Did you have anything in mind for that specifically?
We will do the usual outreach and notification of the community. If you want us to make any adjustments to this would be one of the principal sort of talking documents. We can do that. We are thinking about some of the other, among these priority A opportunities, we're thinking about what kinds of information would be most useful to people who want to ask questions about them or challenge them or say something's more important than something else.
So my only feedback in that regard would be to remove the scheduling at this point, since we haven't yet made any decisions about the scheduling. It looks premature to be laying out a time frame like that. That's a conversation that we need to have in the wake of that discussion.
Just list them all.
Yes.
Okay. Okay.
All right, any other comments or questions on that? All right, public comment. Does anyone have any questions or comment or feedback from us? Ms. Adams. As usual, I'll ask folks to please approach the front of the room and use the mic, because Amherst Media cannot pick you up unless you speak into the microphone. And please introduce yourself for the folks at home. Thank you.
My name is Maurianne Adams, and I'm on Beston Street in Precinct 10. I really do appreciate having this at this time in advance of the forum on the 20th. I want to comment on three things. The first is, as I thought about some of the issues on your priority list, I feel the real need of that market study that was approved and funded more than a year ago, and I believe has not quite yet gone out for response. It's very difficult, at least for me as a citizen following this process and impacted by parts of it, to know how to position myself without that kind of market study. Really much better information on the number of seniors who might be interested in these residence areas, the numbers of students that we can anticipate in terms of the 60-40 split between the university housing and town housing that I believe is conventional, or at least was part of the past. And so that instead of working on a rumor and fiction, of our imagination, we have some data to go to. So I don't know if you want to respond to that before I continue.
I'll just respond to note that the process of creating the RFP for that study has been ongoing for several weeks, if not months now, and is either just about ready to or has already gone,
It has gone out.
has gone out to bid. So, and
Because I think we're very eager to see the results of that.
do we have a deadline for submissions?
Yes, early July, I believe July 2nd.
Thank you.
Okay. The second is I'm very glad to see you taking up the issue both of conversions of single to duplex and the definitional issues that are related to that, because I think that we're seeing, particularly in our RG neighborhood, a number of houses going very quickly through the conversion process into something that seems to us, in effect, to be rooming houses, that you have 8 unrelated, you have no owner occupied. These are houses that we've seen in the past become nuisance houses and party houses because of their proximity to Southwest and elsewhere on campus. So we're very concerned about this in the Lincoln Avenue, Fearing Street, Sunset, McClure area as more and more for sale signs go up. I'm very relieved to see that you will be looking at the issue of owner-occupied and non-owner occupied, the definitional issue of 8 unrelated, which I think is, by its connection with duplex, becomes almost an open door from our perspective to 8 and more than 8 unrelated, which also then becomes a rooming house, many cars parked, noise, nuisance, etc. The third issue that I'd like to mention that is related but not the same as the houses, the rental houses issue, is trying to think about an area of town which would be appropriate for large numbers of students and mixed use that is not connected to a fragile or vulnerable neighborhood. I think the reason that many of us were in dissent on the issue both of Gateway and of North Amherst Town Center was because it seemed so apparent to us that the townhouses and condos would have large numbers of students, and these were already residential neighborhoods. It would be very helpful to have some kind of town analysis or study to identify places that might be appropriate for such development that would not have that kind of negative impact on the neighborhoods. And so that is something I would very much like to see the town look at, and it's really not part of this priority list. And then finally, an item that I see is on the fall 2013 list is a matter of some concern to us, and that is pre-rental inspection and certification. It might feel premature to some of the other bylaws you want to change, but that seems to us to be really the kind of the gold star of what we need to be able to have enforcement for these non-owner occupied rentals that seem to be getting out of control. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thank you. On the issue of conversions, I do want to point out that the existence of that on our list now is certainly not a reaction to the types of issues that you're describing, but it's something that we've been working on this board for several years now, and we actually brought an article to town meeting a year ago to try to address those issues. So this is not something that's just come out of the blue. It is something that we are concerned about and do plan on addressing.
And I think what I'm commenting on is we may be getting rather late to the party, but this is a party that we would like to support you on.
Thank you.
You bring the cider.
Other comments? Mr. Alpert?
Michael Alpert, actually the previous speaker covered some of the important issues, and so I would just like to reiterate the market study is critical, and then private student housing would be the term that I would use in identifying those areas where we could accommodate students and take the pressure off what seems to be most of the labor in the zoning committee and the planning board and the select board and throughout the town, which is fighting the battle of students but not providing for them. The other question I have is what is the status on the transportation study that I believe UMass was offering as a bone after they took away the property down on North Pleasant Street?
I'm informed that that's very close to being done. In terms of I just wanted to respond briefly to the private student housing question. They're actually, again, this is something that people have been looking at for some years. The challenge is that unless it is on university property, there is always a neighborhood nearby. And every neighborhood considers itself fragile and endangered, and nobody's saying they're wrong. However, if we're going to do something that, unless we find the solution that Mr. Carson is talking about to the way in which state law now works, any place that we're looking at off campus is proximal to somebody's neighborhood, and that's the challenge.
Other comments? Ms. Levine?
Louise Levine, Precinct 1. In regard to the question of student housing and sort of the private partnership, I'd heard about the problems that the state had with sort of going around sort of public bidding. This seems perhaps a little indirect, but could the university somehow do an exchange of land, of their land, with the town, and then it's the town that's in the partnership with a private entity to build student housing? So it'd still be on UMass land essentially, but I don't know.
One attempt to do that was the Gateway Project, which didn't meet with complete success.
Yeah.
So there certainly might be other opportunities. My understanding is that the university and the state are not greatly enthusiastic about losing control of property that they control, but those possibilities might exist. I mean, it's been talked about on University Drive, although that hasn't gone forward either. There might be opportunities for that.
That's excellent.
As Mr. Tucker pointed out, obviously the best place to do things is on the university grounds itself.
Yes.
But you know, it's easy to lose track of the fact that the university is doing a lot on its own grounds and has been over several years. It built a major housing complex, North Apartments, north of Eastman Lane. It's obviously in the process of building Commonwealth College now. It's in the process of converting Lincoln Apartments to undergraduate student housing, or graduate student housing, I'm not sure which. Undergrad. So the university is doing a lot in that regard, but certainly it's always worthwhile to look for more. One of the issues that we have, as I explained to Mr. Carson earlier, is that from a zoning perspective, that's not the business that we're engaged in here directly.
I know.
So, you know, which is not to wash our hands of it entirely. We have to think collectively as a town, but we do also have to pay attention to the mandate and authority of each individual group that's working on things. So zoning itself is probably not the most effective way of going after those issues of building partnerships between the university and doing land swaps and things like that. But it's definitely worth thinking about and pursuing in the larger sense.
Yeah. Well, thank you. I was mostly thinking about the surface parking areas on Mass Ave and University as being ideal for apartments.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
If I may, you might want to go to the university's website and look at the university master plan. Part of the plan is to replace a great deal of that parking with buildings, including some residences.
Other questions or comments? Yes. Ms. Keller, sorry, I couldn't see you.
Janet Keller, 120 Pulpit Hill Road, Precinct 1. I would just like to second, third, and fourth the message about the urgency of dealing with the housing issues, the rental, the student housing. I would also like to speak, well, I'd like to ask a question, if I may, regarding the status of the floodplain maps for Eastman Brook and Mill River. And the timing on completing analyses and remapping for those two spots.
The item that's on the list here, which is labeled as FPC rezoning, speaks to that. It doesn't speak specifically to any specific property or area, but it does speak to the townwide effort to more accurately map the flood-prone conservancy district. We took a big step forward on that last year when we converted all of our official zoning maps from the old paper maps from dating back to the 1960s to use the modern computer GIS system that we have in place now, and specifically data from the aerial survey that was performed a couple of years ago that gave us very accurate topographical data town-wide. So we have the tools in place now to do that. What we haven't done is gone through stream by stream and brook by brook and figured out what the exact boundaries of those are, but that is on our list to make that effort and to get better mapping for that. Mr. Tucker.
Our office and the GIS administrator are working with a consultant, talking to both the state and the federal government about how to proceed with that. We have the project will probably occur in stages. There will be an initial project that will survey the areas and the information that we have in detail and determine what information is close enough to accurate to be used for projections and what information we need to go out and completely get new information in the field. So that's sort of the first order. And following that, we will then have a projection for the rest of the project, costs and so forth. But essentially it has begun. We're already in discussions with the consultant.
So as you describe it, it's rather in an early stage. You've begun those conversations. You already have the new computer maps, but what further, deeper analyses are needed and whatnot is still being explored. Is that correct?
We have accurate topographic information. We know where the elevations actually are.
Mm-hmm.
And as Mr. O'Keefe said before, we converted our old FPC districts, which were based on specific elevations in many places and in other places on property boundaries and so forth, to correspond to the new accurate data. So we're now in a position where everything is accurate, whether it's properly mapped or not, it's accurate, and we can go forward from that. And the first stage is having the consultant assess the flood plain information that we have, federal, local. This is actually a rather highly studied area, as you might imagine. There are hydrologists running around all over the place. And what of that information is usable immediately? What of that information needs to be ground checked and truthed, and what information we need to go out brand new in the field and measure and take a look at, taking into account the changes in climate and the rest of it. When that first phase is done, we will then know in detail what it is we're actually going to be doing to finish the rest of it. And in that second phase, part of what we have asked the consultants to do is to discuss with FEMA whether or not FEMA is using in its presumptions about what a flood insurance rate map should consist of changes in climate over time. And so that when we're done, we will have a map that says this is where the 100-year floodplain is based on what the federal government says it should be, so that people can go out and get mortgages and so forth. And we'll get a new set of approved flood insurance rate maps, get them approved by FEMA. Based on that information, we will then enter into a process, a public process, to decide where we want the flood-prone conservancy boundary, the zoning boundary, to be. Because in some places we will want it to be exactly where the 100-year floodplain is, and in other places where it's going through the middle of village centers that have been developed for centuries, we may not want it to correspond to that because it could render huge areas unbuildable. We may want it to be something else. If you know much about flood regulation, there are two areas that are regulated. There is the floodway, where the area within which, during a flood of whatever magnitude, the water is moving and can pick things up and carry them away. And there's the floodplain, which is where the land just fills up with water. It's not moving much. It's just, it goes up and down. And those two areas are regulated differently under federal regulations in terms of how you build, whether you can build, and so forth. So there, as you can see, there are a number of sort of screens that we're going to have to look at when we get to the point of having the new data that everybody agrees, the federal government principally agrees, is accurate and usable for this purpose. And then we have to decide what we want to do with it, how we want to locate the edges of the flood-prone conservancy district, and how we want to use that to regulate development in Amherst.
Thank you, Mr. Tucker.
Right, so if I understand you correctly, then what you're saying is that existing development might trump, would it go so far as to trump what I always used to think? I assume you're equating floodway with what I always used to think of as V zones, velocity zones.
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So, so if there's development, existing development in the path of what you now conclude would be a floodway, the existing development is likely to trump the floodway. Is that the case?
No, what I'm saying is we need to know all of that so we can make decisions. The federal government itself imposes regulation on what can happen in a floodway and imposes regulations on how things can be built in a floodplain. So once we know where those two areas are, there's a set of federal regulation existing already. What we need to decide is how do we, through zoning, through the regulation of the use of land, want to regulate this for Amherst. And there's not necessarily a presumption that one thing will trump another. It's up to the community. What we need is the information.
I see. Okay. I think that is it for the moment. We haven't lost our interest in a coordinated revitalization, and we'll probably be back at you to say, we recognize that you're the zoning subcommittee and that you have a very focused agenda. And we also will be asking you to consider the myriad ways in which you can connect with your colleagues throughout Amherst town government on a broader revitalization effort that could inform and be connected to any future rezoning. We think we are still convinced that that's terribly, terribly important, and I think we all recognize that rezoning is only one tool in the kit, and we very much hope that you'll take that under consideration to be working intensively with the Historic District Commission, say, and some of the other parts of town government on moving forward with vigor on some of those things that we're so interested in. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Were there any other questions or comments before I call on Ms. Adams again? I want to make sure that everyone has a chance to speak. Ms. Perot.
Yes, I'm delighted to see, sorry, Melissa Perot, Precinct 1. I'm delighted to see that regulations are being devised to deal with rental housing. And I'm delighted that we have an enforcement officer now. I wonder whether you could enlighten me as to the process of how that works, how the enforcement officer is going to be able to function in terms of these inspections and so forth. Or is it completely complaint-driven as it has been? Or is there some authority that he will have to? I'd just like to know more about this aspect.
So the enforcement officer is a town employee, and he's not directly connected to what we're doing on this board. So we're not in a position to speak to that directly. I'll turn to Mr. Tucker if he wants to enlighten us with anything he might know about the activities that have been conducted so far. But I would specifically encourage people to talk to the inspections department here in Town Hall if they want more details about that, because they will have much more detail than we do about exactly how that, what parameters are associated with that position. But Mr. Tucker, did you have anything for us?
Our new building commissioner, Rob Mora, will be able to give you more detailed information. I can tell you very briefly that the new enforcement agent is authorized to enforce both building code questions and health and safety code, and that provides a much broader base for responding to problems in a house. You don't have somebody in one silo coming in and then someone else. This person can address a wide range of problems and issues
I think that's good.
with housing.
Does that include, sorry to interrupt, does that include zoning bylaw enforcement also?
It can. That's going to be up to the building commissioner. He's certainly authorized to. He would need to work through the building commissioner, since the building commissioner is the zoning enforcement officer under the zoning bylaw. One of the tasks that both the new enforcement agent and the staff task force that has been working on safe and healthy neighborhoods continuously for about a year and a half, 2 years now, is trying to update our inventory of rental property in Amherst. Part of the challenge here is that since we do not yet have a mechanism, as others were saying before, to identify when somebody sells a single-family residence to someone for the purpose of turning it into a rental, we don't automatically know that. There are signs we can read, but it doesn't tell us definitively that that's the case. There is no mechanism now to capture that in the process and say, oh, you have to register that on our rental registration system, which already exists. So what we're trying to do is develop a comprehensive and reasonably accurate picture of what we have in terms of rental properties in Amherst.
So yes, I understand that the rental units are supposedly registered, but there are many that are not. Is that correct? And so your effort is to register all the rental units,
Yes.
and
eventually
that will be done by this enforcement officer, who will
will
go
be-
around and say, I think there are students in here.
there will be, yeah, that's right.
Or what?
Many people can be heard saying that in Amherst.
Or how
Yes,
does
that will
he,
be part of
or
that
is it a-
person's responsibility and the responsibility of others as well.
but is it a publicly driven, do we alert the enforcement?
Any
or
citizen can at any time
can.
call the inspection services office and say, I think there might be a problem at this property over here.
Right.
Could you please take a look at it?
Right, but is it, so that there is both, then he also can walk around town and say,
Absolutely. He can, as
Is
he
that
drives in to work from home, he can spot things, as can and do the other inspectors. And part of what we've been trying to do, and I'm sorry to take so long on this, but is to coordinate that process of saying, oh, wait a minute, there might be something there, not only with inspection services, but with the health agents who are going out to inspect kitchens or whatever it is, with fire department, when there's been a wastebasket fire, or there's a smoke alarm that's going off because the battery's dead or whatever it is. The police, when they go to check out a party, if they spot a problem, so that everybody is sharing information and there's a much more comprehensive set of data coming in that we can respond to.
and I see you would want a pre-rental inspection and certification of the properties.
We're trying to
Would that
work
be
toward that.
on
yes.
an annual basis or a biannual basis, or you just get it one time and then it can go to hell?
Not that last one. I think it would, there have been a range of discussions on this, and it hasn't been finally determined yet, but part of it would be based on the performance of the property. That someone who regularly seems to be operating their rental properties in a responsible and safe manner, maybe their inspection would be every 2 or 3 years instead of every year. Someone who has an ongoing problem with complaints regular, the inspection might be as often as every 3 months or something. It's not, and don't take those numbers for gospel. It's
Okay.
the range of discussion that's occurring includes that and also includes looking at what other communities are doing. This is not a new phenomenon, although Amherst
No.
has a bad case of it.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Ms. Adams, did you have something else?
Thank you. Maureen Adams, Precinct 10. I do have a question and a comment. The question is a follow-up on Ms. Keller's comments. I'm just wondering about the sequence, if it is taking a while to work with the GIS consultant to update the floodplain data, and we're also in fall town meeting coming back again to look at the North Amherst Village Center. And I recall we had noted at the time we were concerned about the area north of Coles Road that is currently designated a floodplain area. I worry about the sequence there of being asked to consider the extent of the boundaries of the North Amherst Village Center prior to this information being updated.
So it's worth noting that no decisions have been made about whether we will be coming back in the fall
I
with
see.
North Amherst.
you.
That remains to be seen. We need to talk about that more. But it's also worth noting that there are always things that we're working on in zoning. And there's always the potential that they affect each other. So, we're talking about flood-prone conservancy. We're talking about functional family definition. We're talking about rental registrations. We're talking about conversion of single-family homes into duplexes. All of those things are factors that affect North Amherst and other parts of town. There will be more in the future as well. So we're never going to be able to say nothing can proceed until this set of things have completed, because there will always be more things in that set. So, we need to be responsible about how we sequence things, but it's hard to be absolute and say that nothing will ever happen until everything else has happened. Because
I agree, there are no fixed stopping places or starting places, but I was particularly concerned about that one possible sequence.
Okay.
The second is, I just want to comment that I think as we talk about the difficulties of the rentals that I mentioned earlier, we're increasingly seeing these as a landlord-owner problem more than a student problem. I know that earlier discussions have been back and forth about student behavior, and I really wanted to say that at least in my conception of this, the university is doing what it can in terms of the code of student conduct, and that our real concern as a town is with the good business practices both of the owners and the management companies. And we understand this is a very complex difficulty with many different pieces, and we really support you on working on the multiple places of this toward what I think is the gold standard, which will be rental permits that involve regular inspections.
thank you.
That is owner permits.
Yep. Thank you. And I think Mr. Tucker's points on that were right on in terms of a potential registration and inspection system being responsive to the record that people have demonstrated in some objective way, that you could use a rating system or number of complaints or number of enforcement actions that have been taken in order to both offer incentives for people to have good behavior and obviously to follow up and penalize the people that aren't following through on that. And, frequency of inspections is a very good way of dealing with that. So I look forward to being able to have a system that works that way. Yes, Ms. Fitch.
Laura Fitch, Precinct 1. That reminds me of a question that I've had all along about management and plans, because it's my assumption that when and if new housing is developed in North Amherst, for instance, that a management plan would be required for these. And that's very different than single-family homes, and I've assumed that in some ways is more enforceable. So I would like to hear how one does enforce management plans. What are, if who's ever managing the property doesn't follow through with the letter of the things that they put forward in that plan, what is the enforcement mechanism?
So for any use that requires a land use permit, either a special permit from the Zoning Board of Appeals or a site plan review through the Planning Board, the management plan is part of the permit requirement. So you're required to submit a management plan, and you're bound by the provisions of that management plan. So if your property is not in compliance with what you said you were going to do in the management plan, if you've stopped doing snow removal or maintaining your landscaping or any other aspect that's involved in the management plan, you're no longer in compliance with the conditions of your permit. And the zoning enforcement officer, who's our building inspector, is authorized to levy fines, basically, that can be $100 a day, I believe, for an ongoing issue. But basically, once you're deviating from what's in your management plan, you're in violation of the zoning bylaw, and the town can take action there. Now, that is, in the past, has been entirely complaint-driven. We've heard tonight that it still will likely remain largely or substantially complaint-driven, but with additional staff now to manage that process, there is some expectation that it will be more proactive as well. And the more obvious violations might be very well picked up by the town on its own recognizance, rather than relying on people to come in and report them to us.
Right. So the primary mechanism is through fines, though, if they're found in violation. And is there information available to find out sort of what the history of that has been, and or what sort of fines are levied, and whether it's effective?
We have not used yet, to my knowledge, non-criminal ticketing, which is what it is. You're handing someone a ticket every day saying you're in violation. The police use it on a regular basis for enforcement, not use that method for enforcement of general bylaws and other state laws. We do that instead of, we have that as an option instead of taking people to court, which is costly and time-consuming and not very effective. Although we have a very good housing court in this area, which will increasingly see us. They can look forward to seeing us.
Well, I guess I'd just like to hear more about that as we continue this discussion, because my experience is that the managed housing is less obnoxious to me. I mean, I have friends who live across from Mill Hollow, and it's not Mill Hollow that's their bad neighbor, it's the single family next door.
Yeah.
So I would like to learn more about how it's enforced and have that discussed more, because I think there's a misconception there. Thanks.
Thank you.
And yes, Barbara Puffer and I are here today because, we are very much interested in being involved in revitalization.
Thank you. Ms. Puffer.
Following up on Barbara Puffer, Precinct 1. Yeah, one aspect of this process that is very important to me, and I thank you for all your work. I walk my precinct very frequently. I'm talking about Montague Road, the park, Summer Street, State Street, Pine Street. I do my mile loop Pulpit Hill Road. What I am noticing in my neighborhood, and I can't speak for Lincoln Ave and so forth, I can only speak for my neighborhood, is a few houses are minimally maintained. I don't see them falling down, but I do see minimal management as far as painting and aesthetic aspects. Maybe there is somebody who can tell us if most of the complaints center around one particular or two particular types of disturbance. What I see on Montague Road, one house, Coles Lane, one house, and a couple on Summer Street, because I go by them when there's beer bottles and beer cans all over the lawn, is student drinking. This problem goes back to when I was a kid. One of the big attractions for private investors was when the university started talking about banning student drinking on campus. This fueled an industry for student housing off campus. I see that continuing because I live within 3 minutes walk of Big Eye Liquors and Watroba Liquor Store. Now I know that your zoning people And, you know, you say this every time we talk about traffic and every time we talk about student drinking. But any complaint that I have lodged has been about scary behavior from either students drinking or other substance abuse, and not because their kitchen is messy or they have cockroaches. But I could be wrong. Yes, I'm interested in the process. We have spent inordinate amounts of time, money, energy, goodwill in doing something positive for North Amherst. We're still interested, but it's getting expensive. And all that money is money that we are not able to put into a development that would generate revenue to help this town. Notice Scandinavians moved out, Silverscape Design moved out. Out of North Amherst, we had a hair salon, we had a pharmacy moved out. How many more businesses can move out of Amherst without it becoming impossible for us to live here, never mind our poor policemen, our town committee members, and our firemen? Thanks. Have a nice summer. See you in the fall.
Thank you.
For those who are interested in the issue of student drinking, I believe it's the Campus Community Coalition is the entity that is working on that issue rather in concert with UMass rather strenuously. And I can, if anyone is interested, I can give you the contact information for them. And that goes to enforcement of the student code of conduct off campus and other things as enforcement mechanisms.
Right. It's worth pointing out that just in the past year, the university has revised its policies such that the Code of Student Conduct applies to all students of the university, whether they're living on campus or off campus. And the university does feel that that's having a substantial impact in terms of people's mindset about their behavior on campus versus off campus. So it takes, university is like a big ship. It takes a long time for cultural changes to steer their way through the system, because your crop of students is constantly replenishing itself. But for the past year, we have had the first set of students working within that set of expectations that they are bound by that Code of Student Conduct, both off campus and on campus. All right. Seeing no other hands, we will move on to our schedule for next meetings. As I already noted earlier, our next scheduled meeting is Wednesday, June 20th, 2 weeks from tonight, which is our semi-annual zoning forum. Please come and tell us what you think about your zoning priorities and our zoning priorities. After that, our next regularly scheduled Wednesday would be July 4th, and I think that nobody is interested in meeting that evening. So our next meeting would be July 18th. I think we would need to have a meeting that night to work on all the many issues in front of us, and that would, I'm not sure whether we're having a planning board meeting that night or not. Chris, do you happen to know?
There is one
There is one?
scheduled.
Okay, so then
You'll
definitely.
be discussing that at your planning board meeting tonight.
Okay, so we will plan on a zoning subcommittee meeting at 5 p.m. on July 18th. Anything further before we adjourn? Seeing nothing, we are then adjourned at 6:05 p.m. Thank you, everyone.
It's one of the shortest meetings I've ever had. I don't know what I'm going to do with myself for the next 15 minutes.
Goodness, I wasn't expecting
55, yes.
You must be tired. Are you taking off?
Unless you need me.
Nope. I can handle it, she said bravely.